I've been asked to welcome you here, and it is my great honor to welcome you here tonight to our Sheldon Wolfe Lecture this evening. All of you who are here know that Shel and Rhoda, there she is, I was just looking for you. Shel and Rhoda are absolute pillars of this community, not only here at Shearith Israel, but in the extended Jewish community and beyond. Leaders in every way, by every definition. And Rhoda, you have continued this legacy, not only to remember your beloved Shel through this lecture series, but to keep doing the amazing works that your family has brought to the larger community to make our world better. And so we are so honored to have you here, to have number one over here. And I can't use your real name. I can't. He's number one from this community who became a rabbi. And like I now say, number one to retire too. So
I'm trying to set a good precedent for you.
And I'm not going to wait to be number 6 to retire. Rabbi Greg Wolfe, who's back home with us here tonight. And also, I know that Julie is here, and I know that Amy is here. There we go. Julie and Amy are here as well, which is really a privilege to have you guys here, especially on this important evening for the Jewish people in San Francisco and all of that. I'm going to let Greg introduce Rabbi Shai. It is our incredible privilege to have him with us tonight to teach us. He promised this morning he was going to solve all the world's problems. So without further ado.
When you read the newspaper tomorrow, you'll see they've been all solved. Everything is done.
It's going to be great.
That's going to be great. Anyway, welcome. It's so great to see everyone here. I have to say, you know, coming back to this room, having grown up here, I always think of the Purim Carnival. I don't know, Jessica, do you remember the Purim Carnivals and the goldfish?
How many goldfish?
We're right here, and I think this is an improvement. This is a big improvement, and we want to welcome those of you in the congregation, friends, and family who are here tonight as we honor my dad's memory, who also grew up here. This was a very important place for him. And it was interesting that tonight, I've never found a parking place in front of the synagogue. And my dad had a very special parking karma. And I think he passed it, but I do feel his presence tonight because literally I got the parking place right in front. So he was, and I didn't think about it, but I thank you for helping me remember that moment. This opportunity, this is our second annual lecture, and we're looking forward to future ones, but we couldn't have found a better speaker and scholar to share with us tonight than Rabbi Shai Held, who I met, I can't remember how many years ago it was at Ohala, a clergy conference, and I was immediately taken by him, by his intelligence, his wit, his warmth, his spirit, which I think in many ways my dad would love you, and he would probably know all the same jokes, and he would appreciate that. And right away after I met Rabbi Shai, I went and bought his 2-volume commentary on the Torah, which was a fabulous companion while I was an active rabbi doing, you know, regular Torah study. So if you guys are involved in your Torah study groups, I recommend you get the book. But his latest book, and really what was set him off, which is not really the topic of our conversation tonight, but I did want to just let you know that Rabbi Shai's most recent book is Judaism is About Love, and it's really a deep look at our Jewish tradition and how important love is. And a lot of times, even Jewish people think, oh, yeah, love, that's the Christian thing. But he really opens us up to see that, no, love is a fundamental part of our Jewish tradition, and God knows we need a lot of love these days. And if we could share some of that love, it would be very important, and particularly when it comes to Israel. And Israel is also very important to my dad. And this lecture series was to bring topics of Israel to the congregation. And I found out that Rabbi Shai had done a lot of intense research in his earlier years. I don't know, it was during your PhD time, I think, that he was doing that. He was Harvard educated. He founded or co-founded the Hadar Institute in New York, which is an amazing center of Jewish learning. They've got yeshiva programs for college students, for adults, a lot of free information classes that can be downloaded. Many people are familiar with Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg, his is a part of their cohort and their teaching. I haven't read Rabbi Yitz's new book, but I'm sure it's a page turner. But what is he, 94 already?
91.
91. When I was at HUC, we had a chance to go to their house with him, and he would do a thing with all the rabbis from different seminaries to come together. But so we invited Rabbi Shai to talk with us tonight a little bit more, to bring us sort of a sense of the history and the dreams and the hopes of the Jewish people, which I know sometimes when we look at what's happening today, we think, boy, what's happening? But I think it's important for us to remember how these began and the different visions and the great hopes and dreams that Israel represented, and how we might continue to strive to work to bring those dreams to fruition. So it's a great honor, and with great love, we welcome Rabbi Shai Held and invite him to take it.
Thank you, Greg. Good evening, everyone. I didn't have the privilege of knowing Sheldon Wolfe, but I will just say from the brief experience of meeting his family, I can make certain assumptions about the kind of person he was, so it feels like a special honor to speak in his memory. I know this is going to sound very odd, but since you've told me about how you think I have the same sense of humor as your father, I will tell you the Jewish joke that has been on my mind constantly for the last few days. Many of you probably know this joke. I think it is actually the greatest Jewish joke ever told. Really, I mean this, right? These two Jewish guys, probably know this joke. These two Jewish guys are walking down the street, passing each other. One of them says, "Hyman, how are you?" And Hyman says, "In one word, good. In 2 words, not good." I mean, tell me, is there any joke that encapsulates Jews better than that joke? I mean, it's really amazing. So when Greg and I sort of went back and forth about what I should talk about tonight, we settled on the idea of Zionist dreams. That is, what are the dreams that animated and drove the Zionist project? And I thought what I would try to do is present that by talking about 3 of Zionism's biggest dreamers, 2 of whose names are no doubt familiar to most people kind of aware of 20th century Jewish history, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook and Ahad Ha'am, and one of whom is largely forgotten, but I think is a really interesting person to think about, Nahman Syrkin, one of the great theorists of socialist Zionism. There's a very powerful essay that Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, about whom we'll hear shortly, this essay of his that he writes, he says, "Hachalomot hagdolim yisod ha'olam hem." The great dreams are the foundation of the world. No truly religious soul can ever rest content with a broken status quo. I'll quote him, "Grave is the error of those who boast of reality in its defective state. Only the uninhibited dream, which is a revolt against reality and its limitations, is the truly most substantive truth of existence." Right? There's something counterintuitive about this. You might think dreams, that's airy-fairy, right? And he's saying, no, dreams are actually what constitute the deepest level of reality. And one way of thinking about Zionism, for that matter, any revolutionary movement, is asking what are the problems that it aimed to solve, but another way is asking what are the dreams that it meant to enact, right? What is the vision that it's thought to instantiate in the world? And in some ways, those are 2 versions of the same question. One formulated negatively, what's the challenge that you're trying to fix? And one formulated positively, what's the ideal that you're trying to realize? And I probably won't tell you anything you don't know if I say that from its very beginning, Zionism was an extremely diverse movement, so much so, when I was teaching at JTS many years ago, and I was teaching the survey course on the history of Zionism, the curriculum committee was very kind of staid and conservative. And we went through the same process each time. I would submit a course that I called Zionisms. And they would come back and say, the course will be called The Varieties of Zionism. And I would say, I think you are actually thwarting the point I'm trying to make. which is that Zionism wasn't really one thing. It was a lot of different things, animated by very different dreams, with very different visions of the kind of society that ought to kind of flourish in the land of Israel. But fine, have it your way. If you've ever been an academic, you know, at a certain point, you don't fight the curriculum committee. You just complain about it. So as I say, I want to try to introduce you to three of these dreamers and their Zionisms. So first, socialist Zionism. Right? Socialist Zionism was one of the main currents within the Zionist movement, so much so that for the first 30 years of the state, socialist Zionists were almost completely in charge, right? Labor Zionism ran the country. The existence of socialist Zionism should not be a surprise when you think about the fact that in the 19th century, two of the main competing visions for how to solve the quote-unquote Jewish problem were socialism and nationalism. So it's not surprising that some people thought, rather than choose between those two things, let's figure out a brand of nationalism that will be socialistic all the way down. And there were, it's important to say, very different versions of socialist Zionism. You might even, at the risk of taking my point to an absurdity, talk about socialist Zionisms. But there were different forms of socialist Zionism. Some were thoroughly Marxist, and some, like Nahman Syrkin's, were anti-Marxist. And if that sounds abstract, the important thing to keep in mind about his anti-Marxism is that he was totally committed to rejecting determinism, the idea that history was just unfolding the way it had to, and he wanted to place great emphasis on the historic significance of the decisions that human beings will make, right? The moral and political decisions that you and I make really will determine the outcome of Jewish history. There are not forces that are greater than we are. There's always the possibility of us exercising some agency, and that he understood was a non-orthodox perspective, right? A non-Marxist perspective, okay? Syrkin's dates 1868 to 1924. He was really the first theorist and the leader of socialist Zionism. I'm not going to do long biographies, but born in Belarusia, and he writes an essay in the 1890s, 1898, called The Jewish Question and the Socialist Jewish State. The Jewish Question, common title, but then the solution, Socialist Jewish State, in which he advocates for the idea that animates him for the rest of his life, that the best way, and probably the only way, to realize Zionism would be through the cooperative mass settlement of the Jewish proletariat. Nothing else could actually build a Jewish state. And he becomes, as you might imagine, a highly controversial figure in the Zionist movement. There were Jewish nationalists who thought, why would you dilute Zionism with a particular political ideology? In fact, some of you might find this amusing. Vladimir Jabotinsky famously says, there is a word for the marriage of socialism and Zionism. That word is shatnez, right? Bringing together wool and linen, right? Why would you bring those two things together? And what I want to sort of talk about is why in Syrkin's dream of Zionism was it so central, so crucial to bring together Zionism and socialism, so much so that he says again and again, the only Zionism worth realizing is socialist Zionism. One thing to know, just to understand his vision, is the thing that drove Syrkin crazy was how many Jewish socialists were also assimilationists. That drove him nuts, right? He felt that that was a manifestation not of a social vision, but of a fundamental lack of self-respect. Okay? So now, what are the ideas that animated Syrkin? The first is, Syrkin had this really beautiful idea that at the heart of the Jewish tradition is an insistent, relentless, stubborn nonconformism, a willingness to dissent and critique majority cultures in which Jews find themselves. For example, he says, Jews have had the audacity for 2,000 years to live in a Christian society and critique Christianity's mistakes. Didn't always go well, but Jews have been willing to do that. One of the main critiques, he says, which is actually quite interesting. You have many contemporary Christians who have come around to say this themselves, that Christianity made the mistake of embracing earthly power. Constantine's embrace of Christianity was actually a tragedy for Christianity, not a triumph. It corrupted it all the way down. Right? This is a very interesting debate right now in contemporary Christian theology, which, if people are interested in, I can talk about a little bit later. And in the Middle Ages, Syrkin says, there is a deep hostility between Christians and Jews, and he says something that not all Jews were willing to say. He says, it's not just that Christians hated Jews, we hated them too. The asymmetry, he says, is they had the power to abuse us, whereas we could just hang out and say bad things about them. Right? But they had the power to abuse, degrade, take advantage of us, and so the hatreds were asymmetrical. Now, I want to just add briefly one additional dimension to Syrkin's vision of Judaism, because I think it's beautiful, and you really can't understand why he was such a passionate Jew without understanding this. There were two aspects to Jewish culture, he says, as it developed over time. There are the aspects he calls chol on the one hand, or let's call it like secularity, and Shabbat on the other. Chol is the struggle for survival. It involves things like hating Christians. It involves things like trying to figure out your way very practically in the world. But Shabbat is totally different. Shabbat, and here he sounds very much like a member of the rabbis who wrote the Talmud. Shabbat is a cry from the next world into this one. Shabbat is the pull that a redeemed society exercises on an unredeemed one like the one we find ourselves in. In traditional Jewish language, this is the idea that Shabbat is me'ein olam haba, a foretaste of the world to come. And Syrkin understands this in deeply political, ethical terms, right? The future, the redeemed future in which human beings are treated equally and with dignity makes a claim backwards into history. The future is pulling at us and claiming or reclaiming social equality amidst radical inequality. And then you can hear already the socialist piece beginning to emerge. Similarly, he says, the spirit of the prophets is not some Pollyannish fantasy about the future. It is something that we hold as a beacon that constantly presses upon us to ask, how do we conform in our present reality? Or do we conform in our present reality? And if we don't, how do we try to conform more deeply to the ideal divine command of a truly just society? Now, this is where it gets kind of like messy and ugly. In modern times, he says, anti-Semitism is inextricably bound up with economics. Because the prominence of Jews in the economic and social life of societies creates among the masses an identification of capitalism with Judaism. And attacks on bourgeois society by the declining classes are always coupled with an insistence that Jews are the ones responsible for the miseries of modern society. And Syrkin here is very courageous because he wants to call out over and over and over again, without apology and forcefully, the anti-Semitic trends he identifies within socialist movements themselves. That is, your anti-capitalism and your anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism are actually wound up in a ball, and I will never stop calling that out. It is based on misunderstanding just how weak and vulnerable Jews in fact are, right? Jews are not the ones who are powerful, they're just the ones who are visible. And that's the sort of the claim that he wants to push really hard. And the argument he makes again and again is anti-Semitism is particularly prevalent among the downwardly mobile. It is a déclassé movement, anti-Semitism. He talks about the marriage of crude anti-capitalism and vulgar anti-Semitism. Right? Those two things go together. And the rising classes will never defend the Jews because it works much better for them. Sorry, the ruling classes will never defend the Jews because it works much better to allow the declining classes to direct their anger at the Jews rather than at the people really in charge. So the Jews become, right? It serves all of the competing classes to have anti-Semitism flourish. And the key idea is, right, that in a society where power is distributed unequally and often radically unequally, and where Jews are in fact weak but look superficially powerful, it is the ultimate kind of triple whammy, right? Anti-Semitism will exist and it will thrive. Poverty and anti-Semitism, he thinks, actually stem from the same source, which is the unjust and intolerably unjust distribution of power in society. Now, if I understand Syrkin correctly, and this is what makes him interesting for us tonight, is that he thinks that socialism on its own cannot offer a solution to the Jewish problem because the problem is at once economic and national rather than being purely economic, right? And that's why he thinks that ultimately Jewish socialists who are nothing but Jewish socialists cannot really offer a solution to the problem of the Jewish people. And he says, and I think it's kind of very provocative, that many Jewish socialists are guilty of a kind of unforgivable degree of Jewish self-effacement. We'll just be quiet about being Jews if we just try to make the society a little more just, right? Well, it's fine. We're willing to make that bargain. And he says, essentially, over and over again, have some self-respect. That's the kind of argument that kind of drives him again and again. So what is the dream, right? I said we're going to talk about Zionist dreams. So first, it's important to understand for Syrkin, and personally I find this sort of very inspiring, you cannot build a national movement just based on the vision of rejecting oppression. You need instead the positive dream. Not what are you rejecting, but what are you trying to build? And what he says, and this is like the chutzpah, like only a Jew can talk like this. Not only are we going to solve the Jewish problem, but we're going to create a society that is the model for solving the problem that bedevils all European societies. We'll create the solution. We'll create a society that is truly just all the way down. We'll talk about how in 1 second. And so, in some sense, our chosenness, it's kind of a secularized understanding of chosenness, is that we will model a different way of organizing a society. So we will draw on our willingness to speak out and be nonconformists to protest both class oppression and our national oppression. And we will do that without apologizing and without backing down. And Syrkin says something that you find over and over again in his generation of Zionists, and I sort of love this, right? He says, Zionism is the only non-utopian solution to the Jewish problem. This is to say, Zionists again and again take this idea that everyone else thinks is utopian and say, utopian? This is the only thing that's non-utopian. Utopian is the fantasy that we can have a Europe that's not anti-Semitic. Non-utopian is, we're leaving. Right? Non-utopian is, we'll build a different society because yours is rotten. And that's sort of the chutzpah of Jewish dreaming here, right? Again and again, they take these ideas that everyone derides as utopian and say, what are you talking about? This is the only thing that is in fact not utopian. That which is realizable is that which you mistakenly think is utopian. So socialism needs Zionism because on its own, socialism can't solve the Jewish problem. But why does Zionism need socialism? And here Syrkin says something I think is really precious. I think a lot of contemporary Americans kind of find this, will find this quaint. Some of you might find it heroic, I'm not sure. He says, look, capitalism is a fact. It is what happens when people don't plan a society out in advance. You kind of live together and radical inequality emerges. Socialism is what happens when you build a society based on a vision. When you build a society in which you think every last person should have what they need in order to flourish. This is really robust, unapologetic kind of socialism is the great lechatchila in Jewish language. It is the great preferable way that you go about building a society. Listen to Syrkin for a minute. I just want to share this with you before I leave him. This is him, his words. It is inconceivable that people will agree to the creation of an autonomous state based on social inequality, for this would amount to entering into a social contract of servitude. No new social contract will ever come to be unless its foundation is freedom. Social inequality is the product of the impersonal forces of history. The aim of conscious social action is to change the status quo along rational lines and to elevate it morally. The argument is really audacious. No one would consciously sit down and say, let's make a capitalist society in which some people are going to end up homeless. No sane person would do that, according to Syrkin. Rather, let's create a society in which everyone is fairly treated, labor is properly compensated, etc. He says one last thing that I think is sort of fascinating, and maybe I'll leave him with that. He says, there is a unique opportunity in human history that Zionism represents. Because Zionism is not taking an existing status quo in a society and trying to fix it. It's starting from scratch. And that never happens. So we have this opportunity to sit down and say something that people never get to say. Hey, guys, designing a society from the beginning, what are our goals? And then he says, in a way that can feel quaint and tragic given human nature, obviously one of those fundamental goals is the radical commitment to equality. Obviously. So it's, how often is it going to happen in human history, he says, when people are going to start a society and say, hey, we can totally make all the big decisions with nothing we're fighting against. Don't squander this opportunity. So this is the dream, right? A nonconformist minority re-envisions what society in general can look like and sets about building it as a true or lagoyim, right? A true light unto the nations. We can talk or not later in the Q&A about what, if anything, remains of this socialist dream. But I will tell you that I sometimes, just because I'm sort of weird this way, imagine Nahman Syrkin picking up a book called Startup Nation. And being like, what happened here? Okay. Religious Zionism. Religious Zionism also comes in several forms. The most interesting kind of example of a divide that cuts through religious Zionism and its origins is that some theorists thought of Zionism in thoroughly messianic terms. This is about the kind of theological redemption of the Jewish people and perhaps the whole world. And others said, Zionism is a fulfillment of the mitzvah of saving Jewish lives. What do you messianize? What do you talk about messianism? Right? Just talking about, right? We can't live in Europe, so we're going to go to where we belong and live there. Right? These are very different. One claim is very grand, and one claim is more modest. Right? So I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about the one religious Zionist figure whose influence over time, not so much in his own time, but over time, became so vast that he ended up sort of overshadowing and leading us to forget almost everybody else. And that's Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, 1865 to 1935, starts out as a fairly conventional Lithuanian Orthodox rabbi, and then ends up, through a series of circumstances, the chief rabbi of Jaffa, where he is confronted with Jews who are, on the surface at least, not just not religious, but anti-religious. And as I'm going to talk about tonight, how to make sense of that becomes his central theological project. And here, I'm going to ask you in a few minutes to fasten your seatbelts as I try to sort of explain the way he tries to make sense of that. But Kook was a man of many dreams, as I started, right, with the statement, "Chalomot haGdolim Yesod ha'olam," the great dreams are the foundation of the world. I want to briefly share two dreams of his. One of which I share because it is so excruciatingly painful to the point of unbearable, I think, from the perspective of 2024. And one of which because I think it's just so fascinating. And I also want to be clear, this first dream, I'm not making any veiled political statement here. I'm happy to talk about my own opinions if anyone actually cares about that. I just actually want to understand Kook, okay? The first dream I want to call this. This is a quote from Rav Kook: "The world is becoming sweeter." There's a fundamental tension in Rav Kook's thought. On the one hand, he sees a really serious danger in nationalism, in that nationalism all too often descends into aggressiveness and belligerence. On the other hand, he is confident that the Jewish people's unique qualities, their sigulot in his language, will prevent that from happening. Our nationalism will be different from regular nationalism. This, of course, is an irony given what has happened to religious Zionism since 1967. That is, like many early religious Zionist figures, Kook wrote again and again that the task of religious Zionism would be to help the broader Zionist movement restrain itself from the baser instincts of nationalism. Religious Zionism would be what prevents Zionism from becoming jingoistic. If you think about someone like Abraham Isaac Kook, seeing someone like Itamar Ben-Gvir, he would, rip his hairs out one by one. I think it's actually very important to understand that, meaning he really understood, as many early religious Zionists did, we're actually in this movement to prevent that. Right? That's actually one of the most interesting historical ironies of how Israeli history unfolds. That's a topic for another night. There was actually, if anyone is interested, I don't know if they're still on the Hadar website. I've actually given a lecture series on sort of how religious Zionism went from this understanding of itself to its contemporary understanding of itself. So let me come at this from another way. Rav Kook, of course, was a Jewish nationalist and an unapologetic one at that. And yet, as he writes, this is a problem because to have a nation state means we have to have an army. And to have an army presumably means that there might be times when you have to go to war. But, says Rav Kook, it is self-evident that Jews are not permitted to go to war. So how is Zionism possible? And here's what I said this is the tragedy of Kookian Zionism. During World War I, Rav Kook publishes an essay called HaMilchama, the war, right? World War I was not World War I then, it was just the World War, right? And in it, he says something that is really remarkable for a religious thinker. He says, although galut, or exile, was forced upon us by our enemies, on some level, we assented to it. Because, he says, I'm going to quote here for a minute, we were awaiting the advent of a happier time, when government could be conducted without ruthlessness and barbarism. That is the day for which we hope, end quote. So as difficult and damaging as the exile has been, and as long and torturous as it has been, it was also necessary, he says, because, I'll quote him again, our soul was disgusted by the dreadful sins that go with political rule in evil times. I'll read that quote again. Our soul was disgusted by the dreadful sins that go with political rule in evil times. So what has changed, says Rav Kook, that enables me, Rav Kook, to embrace Jewish nationalism and to encourage the Jewish people to re-enter history and return to power? And here's the passage that I find, to my mind, this is the most devastating paragraph in all of 20th century Jewish thought. He says, quote, you ready for this? The day has come, it is very near, when the world will grow gentler. We can begin to prepare ourselves, for it will soon be possible for us to conduct a state of our own, founded on goodness, wisdom, justice, and the clear light of God. It is not appropriate for Jacob to engage in political life at a time when statehood requires bloody ruthlessness and demands talent for evil. But that time is now over. That is the messianic fantasy of World War I. A lot of people, not just Jews, talk this way. Rav Kook says at one point, if I remember correctly, the worse the war is, the greater the redemptive potential, because people realize we can never do this again. Right? This is a century later. You see what I mean by this being, and this, I think, no matter what your politics are, these paragraphs should be excruciating. right? They're just really excruciating. So Rav Kook's dream, his first dream, is this, right? We, the Jewish people, will be able to live in our land, finally, without our lives and our soul being sullied by violence and by killing. It's such a dramatic example of what happens when messianic fantasies crash into the stubborn realities of this world. To put this one other way, what makes Rav Kook almost quaint to read 100 years later is that his messianism allowed him to avoid dealing with all of the difficult questions that sovereignty raises about ethics. Rav Kook didn't really need an ethics of power because he simply imagined that we lived in a world that was so different from the one we actually do live in that he didn't have to confront those questions. So you might say there's almost a Pollyannishness about this, okay? Or to put it in a very simple way, if your dream of what makes Zionism possible is a total moral transformation of humanity, what happens when that moral transformation fails to materialize? Okay. The second dream is this, and this is the part where I'm going to sort of ask you to fasten your seatbelt for a minute, and I also realize what time it is, but I only started at 7:15, right?
That's true.
Okay. So, what is secular Zionism really? So Rav Kook was absolutely convinced that the Jews of his time, as I said, were living through the first glimmerings of the coming of the Messiah. And that is part and parcel of the cosmic drama of redeeming the whole world. The whole world is going to become unified and reconnected to its source, namely God. And so the Zionist movement would have a crucial role to play, not just in fixing the predicament of the Jewish people, but also in ushering a new age in which all humanity and all peoples would together serve God. So Zionism is, at its bottom, a movement of teshuvah. It is part of a cosmic process of return. And then comes a big problem. If Zionism is part of a cosmic problem of teshuvah, why am I hanging out in Yaffo with a bunch of people who want to import pigs and eat them? No, I'm sorry to put this in a crude way, but like, what is happening here, right? How can it be that at one and the same time, Zionism is a movement of return, and people are casting off the traditional practices of Judaism in a more active way than they ever have before? How can I put my world back together? And here, Rav Kook combines his deep learning in Kabbalah and his exposure to Hegel into an amazing sort of tour de force in understanding what's happening in Jewish history. From Jewish mystical tradition, he learns that things are not often what they seem, that a truly discerning mystic must be able to see under what on the surface seems obvious. And from Hegel, he learned about the cunning of history and divine providence. History sometimes uses people to accomplish things that are very different from what they themselves think they are trying to accomplish. You see where this is going, right? Kook took upon himself the unbelievably chutzpahdik and visionary task of explaining Zionism to itself, because he said most of the Zionist leadership does not actually understand what it itself is doing. It is my job to uncover the inner light of Zionism that is not yet brought to consciousness. Now, there's a few premises here that are worth keeping in mind. Number one, the human being, by dint of being a human being, is endowed with an ineradicable yearning for God. We can pretend it's not true. We can create entire cultures that deny it's true. Hell, we can even produce people like Richard Dawkins. It's still true. There's an ineradicable yearning, he says, in the human soul for God. Genuine heresy is actually an impossibility. Deep down, everyone is connected to God. By the way, you can already imagine why some secularists say, excuse me, right? But what Rav Kook is doing is offering the most generous reading of people that he's capable of given his own assumptions. And if human beings in general have an ineradicable yearning for God, the Jewish people, who have an eternal covenant with God, are all the more so. To be a Jew and to sever my connection with God is a contradiction in terms. And more than that, the covenant with God has a special ontological connection to the land of Israel. To imagine that in the land of Israel I could cast off my connection to God as a Jew is to imagine something that is not just impossible, but incoherent. So just think about this for a minute. Human beings, intrinsically all the way down connected to God. Jews, in some sense, even more so. Jews in the land of Israel, even more so. We are in an eternal and indissoluble covenant. So according to Kook, any Jew who dedicates his life to the people of Israel and the land of Israel is thereby already serving the God of Israel, whether or not he or she knows it or admits it. So I think there are two levels to the argument he wants to make. One is negative. It is impossible for Jews to utterly abandon God. And the second is positive. The great passion that so many Jews display in restoring the people and its land is proof, if you will, that despite appearances, something very deep and theological is going on here. Now listen to his most outrageous paragraph ever. Okay? Just bear with me for a minute. There is an eternal covenant, he says, which assures the whole house of Israel that it will never become completely impure, tameh. Yes, it may be partially corroded, but it can never be totally cut off from the source of life. Many of the adherents of the present national revival maintain that they are secularists. If a Jewish secular nationalism were really imaginable, then we would indeed be in danger of falling so low as to be beyond redemption. And then comes what I think is the most kind of like outrageous claim that a Zionist thinker ever makes. Ma shehem rotzim einam yodim ba'atzmam. What the secular nationalists want, they themselves do not know. The spirit of Israel is so closely linked to the spirit of God that a Jewish nationalist, no matter how secularist his intention may be, is despite himself imbued with the divine spirit, even against his own will. So how is it that at the very advent of Zionism, we are also seeing a kind of rebellious secularism? He says, look more closely. These secularists, they're not casting off religion because they are, gluttonous. They are casting off religion because the religion that they encounter is not focused on redemptive dreams. It's focused on the small stuff. The rejection of religion is because religion too has rotted. This is where he's much more interesting than some of his secular critics understand. They think what he's saying is, secularists don't understand what they're doing. Eventually they'll realize that they really are religious, and then we'll all live happily ever after. It's not what he's saying. He is also saying that. But he's saying secular people are casting off religion, and the religion they are casting off, in many ways they're right. And they're casting it off paradoxically for holy reasons. This is a holy heresy. And what will happen is eventually they will come to understand their religious impulses, but the religious people will also understand that what religion is has to be completely understood differently. He says, for example, in his letters, that many Haredim, many ultra-Orthodox Jews, suffer from what he calls tardei mat hachayim. They are sleeping while they're alive. If you ask them, what is your picture? This is actually on some level also unfair, but he's making an argument, right? What is your vision of what Judaism is about? They say, I don't have time for that. I'm trying to decide whether this tuna fish is kosher. Right? He says that's very important, whether it's fish kosher. But the real thing that you should be thinking about is God wants a society that is just and whole, and you've lost any ability to talk about those questions. So you too have something to learn from these ostensibly anti-religious rebels. That's the real dialectic that everyone misses about Rav Kook. Everyone. The most people miss about him. There have been secular theorists who have secular writers, secular journalists who have said, oh, so what you're saying is we'll do all the work, we'll build the state, and then we'll do tshuva and become just like you. But that's not really what he's saying. Because what he's saying is everyone will have to change and realize that core aspects of what it really means to be a religious Jew have been lost on them. A religious Jew is someone who is obsessed with the idea of a just society because that's what God demands of us. And so, right, there is this really interesting reality here, and with this I will leave Kook aside, that in a funny way, he actually accepts a lot of the secular Zionist critique of religion. He just thinks that the answer is not secularity, but a rediscover of religion in a better form. What is needed is not less Torah observance, but more and better Torah observance. A deep embrace of the deepest truths of Torah that are now tragically hidden. So what's the problem here? So first of all, let's say, what's the dream, right? The dream is that we will have a thoroughly healed Judaism that integrates commitment to things like halachic observance, on the one hand, and a total commitment to a radically just egalitarian society. It's economically egalitarian, not gender egalitarian, friend. A radically economically egalitarian society, right? The problem is, of course, first of all, is, as philosophers have never tired of pointing out, the paternalism here is very strong. I understand you better than you understand yourself, which is always a dangerous thing to say. And number two, and this is really, really fascinating, Rav Kook's students, and especially his grandstudents, will express fury about the fact that from their perspective, what Rav Kook promised was that secular Zionists would maintain their idealism and jettison their secularity. But in fact, they jettison their idealism and maintain their secularity. And it's one of the reasons why you find many religious Zionists today expressing incredible rage at, quote, Tel Aviv. Because Tel Aviv is not idealistic. It's not, forget about whether you think it is or it isn't. From their perspective, right? Most people are not sitting around Tel Aviv saying, let's imagine what a perfect society will look like. They're living in a European city in Hebrew. For this is what Zionism was for? So I can have fancy cafes with fabulous people sitting outside? That's what this was for? Right? So sort of, it didn't work. But the dream is of almost, I think you could say, secular and religious Jews, each healing the part of Judaism they've lost, and thereby together constructing a perfect society. Okay, more briefly, let me say something about cultural Zionism. Okay? Achad ha'am. Achad ha'am literally means one of the people. He was anything but. His name was Asher Ginsburg, roughly the same generation, Hasidic background, yeshiva education, becomes secular, but crucially, and this is where he becomes the controversial figure even among cultural Zionists, deeply committed to and passionate about Jewish texts and tradition. A Jewish secularity that is stripped of things like a passion about Tanakh and Talmud is a Jewish secularity that is worth nothing, according to Achad ha'am. So Achad ha'am was at once Zionism's most articulate spokesman and its most vociferous internal critic. And a useful frame for thinking about this, and I'll try to do this briefly, is he never got tired of attacking Herzl. It drove him crazy, right? And the reason is very, very interesting. And so it's worth understanding this because I think you can understand certain aspects of Israeli society specifically through this. The purpose of Zionism, Achad ha'am says, is to reconstitute Jewish natural culture and to reinstate a sense of what he calls Jewish spiritual vocation. Zionism, he says, and this is the thing that makes political Zionists furious. He says, if you think Zionism is going to solve the problem of the majority of the Jewish people, or that the majority of the Jewish people are ever going to live in the land of Israel, you are living in what might be called La La Land, right? Alt New Land, Herzl's great political novel, he says is nothing but one great assimilationist fantasy. If I can speak Jewish language for a minute, Herzl is an Amoritz and proud of it. He knows nothing about Judaism and he cares less, right? And Palestine is never going to sustain any but a tiny fraction of the Jews. And it's not even going to make anti-Semitism go away. Good Shabbos, right? It's like, it's not going to make anti-Semitism go away. So what are his core ideas? Right? Again, I'll do this as quickly as I can. The true and the primary work of Zionism is cultural and spiritual. It is not political. Palestine, Eretz Israel, is a solution to a spiritual problem, not a socio-economic one. Or, as Ahad puts it, infuriating many of the leadership of the Zionist movement, Zionism can help West European Jews whose problem is identity. It cannot really help East European Jews whose problem is economic despair. And the political Zionists all say, you elitist snob. What about those East European Jews who are in crisis? And Ahad says, what about them? You're not offering them anything either. You're offering them pie in the sky. How is this going to happen? You're going to pick them all up and move them, and lo and behold, we're going to have a country? How does that happen? So he says, this is first. This is his quote. Not a safe refuge, but a home for the healing of the spirit. Zionism is a solution to the problem of Judaism, much more than it can ever be the solution to the problem of the Jews. The plight of the Jews in Eastern Europe is not the question to which Zionism is an answer. I cannot tell you how much Herzl hated him for this. And the feelings were mutual, right? Because Herzl was like, well, the whole thing is a political project. And Ahad says, yeah, it's ridiculous. It can't deliver what it promises. It can't do it. He is the first, as far as I can tell, Zionist thinker to say, we can and should eventually create a Jewish state which will never provide a haven for the majority of Jews in the world. No more than a small fraction of the world's Jews will ever live there. Now, what Ahad didn't bargain for is how much Jews outside of Israel would assimilate, and so you'd end up having a greater and greater percentage of Jews living in the land of Israel, right? But that's because of the failure of diaspora Judaism, he would say, not because of the success of Zionism. In other words, to the extent that Ahad had any time for political Zionism, it's because he thought that maybe political Zionism would eventually enable Jews to awaken to their deeper and more rooted needs of having a connection to Judaism. Or to put that differently, Herzl is offering a vision of Zionism that is entirely negative, right? It is based on giving us a refuge to run away from Europe to. Or as he really obnoxiously put it, if anti-Semitism went away, Herzl Zionism would go away too, which shows you that it's bankrupt. If you didn't have anti-Semitism, you wouldn't have Zionism. He says, my Zionism, if we didn't have anti-Semitism, nothing would change. Because my Zionism is actually about figuring out what it means to be a Jew after religion, which is how he understands what modernity is, and yet to stay rooted in the Jewish tradition. And again, we could go round and round and round of people yelling at him, historians still yelling about this. Jews are in crisis in Europe and you offer them nothing. And again, Ahad's response is, neither do you, I'm just honest. Right? That's the outrageous battle in the Zionist world about this issue. I'll say quickly, I'm going to skip most of what I was going to say about him so we can have some conversation. But Echad Ha'am really believed that the land, a robust community in the land of Israel could help solve the spiritual problems, not just of the Jews living there, but also the spiritual problems of the Jews who didn't live there. His opponents always said, so let me get this straight, you're going to take a few thousand Jews in the land of Israel and they're going to solve the secularization of Jews in Europe and America. What does that actually look like? And I think Echad Ha'am said, well, they will model what a robust Jewish culture looks like. They will model what it would mean. But the premise is Jewish life in the diaspora will and must continue to go on. If you're familiar with the Zionist idea of Shlilat HaGolah, the negation of the diaspora, Echad Ha'am wanted nothing to do with that. To negate the diaspora is to basically say a majority of the Jewish people I'm writing off. They're never going to live in Israel. So instead of being allowed to lay down the burden of Judaism, Jews in the diaspora would see this community in the land and be inspired by it to embrace a more robust understanding of their Jewishness. Now, I, Shai Held, will now insert one editorial comment that I hope doesn't offend you. What ended up happening instead is a lot of American Jews, instead of rediscovering Jewish culture through Zionism, kind of made their whole identity political about Zionism. I say that with no value judgment at all. Just want to understand, you understand what I mean by that? Meaning, like, instead of, oh, my relationship to Israel is I'm now going to be reading Israeli novels about the Talmud, it's instead I'm going to go to AIPAC. That is not what Echad Ha'am had in mind, right? That is, it didn't, in other words, for most American Jews, the connection was not in fact cultural, it was political. And we could analyze sort of why that is, okay? One last thing that is maybe really helpful as a lens for thinking about this, Echad Ha'am hates the title of Herzl's most famous book, which is mistranslated in English as the Jewish state, right? Die Judenstaat does not mean the Jewish state, it means the state of the Jews. And Echad Ha'am said a real Zionist leader would have written a book called Die Jüdische Staat, the Jewish state. Herzl has no Jewish state. Herzl is an assimilationist now, he was an assimilationist yesterday, and he will always be an assimilationist. He knows nothing about Judaism, and he cares nothing about Judaism. He's only trying to solve a political problem by building a Western European enclave in the Middle East. That's not what this is for. That was an outrageous comment, right? Yeah. I dream, he says, of overcoming the fantasy of a Judenstaat and replacing it with a Jüdische Staat, a genuinely Jewish state. Now, here's really, sorry, I want to just say one other thing, because I think this is actually really important. What does Zionism enable that American Judaism, for example, can never enable? This is really, really important. Number one, genuine knowledge of the sources of the past, which enable us to speak as Jews. And number two, active involvement of those sources in every realm of social, cultural, and political life, such that the Jewish tradition is able to speak to all aspects of life in a way that no American synagogue ever can. Judaism is part of a religion, Judaism in America is part of a society where religion is always pushed to the margins. So like you give a few cliche sermons about Tikkun Olam, but you don't actually do the work of figuring out what does the Talmud say about distributing health care? What do the prophets teach us about what a society ought to look like? Those are the questions for a cultural and spiritual Zionist. They are political also, ultimately. But the point is, in our own place, we can actually allow Judaism to speak about all the things that it cares about. And in diaspora, that is always at least somewhat truncated and sometimes even desiccated. That, by the way, I have to say, in my humble opinion, is a very good argument. It is, in some ways, to me, one of the best arguments for Zionism there is. Okay, there is a lot here that I am going to leave out. But I do want to point out that Echad Ha'am also had one other claim to fame in the Zionist movement. He was the first person who was a leader in the movement who said, he writes a famous essay called Emet Me'eretz Yisrael, Truth from the Land of Israel, in which he says, none of you are willing to confront the fact that a Jewish nationalist movement will turn the Arabs of Eretz Yisrael into Arab nationalists. None of you are being honest with yourselves. And he says, yeah, first of all, you're condescending to them. You think you're like, oh, look, we're bringing them opportunity. The fact is, when people see nationalism in their own land, they become nationalists themselves. This, what you're doing, will not end well. He never comes back and revisits that, right? It's a famous article about a Echad Ha'am thing called Much Ado About Not Very Much, meaning it's one essay that he writes, but it's it's like a kind of a hallmark in the unfolding of Zionism's self-critique, which is like, you can't just build a national movement and assume that because the Arabs of Palestine are not nationalists now, they won't become nationalists, right? That is a very naive argument, he says. So what I've just tried to do is to sort of lay out, here's what I mean by Zionisms, right? This socialist utopia, a model for what all human civilization could be like, a messianic redemptive dream of Zionism where everyone discovers the deepest truth of Judaism and builds a society that God, as it were, can be proud of, and a cultural revival that allows Jewish tradition after faith, if you will, which I think is important to Echad Ha'am, and yet does not cast off Judaism, but rather embraces it all the more deeply and develops a kind of truly secular, truly traditional way of talking, thinking, and living. Big dreams often encounter stubborn realities. I would say that on some level it goes without saying that we are 0 for 3 on playing out these visions. And the more interesting question is sort of asking what, I don't know if it's the more interesting question, but an interesting question is, what remains of these dreams, or what does one make of the fragments of them that still remain? Okay, thank you.